Fifth Estate.
The facts of Iraq are now beyond dispute. More than 3,000 American soldiers killed. Iraqi deaths in the hundreds of thousands. A civil war that just keeps getting worse. And a U.S. president who seems to be watching it through a looking glass.
We will stay the course. We will help this young Iraqi democracy succeed. And victory in Iraq will be a major ideological triumph in the struggle of the 21st century. In this battle, we have fought for the cause of liberty.
Even after all that's happened, you can still find the administration's version of the war right here at the WhiteHouse.gov website, a kind of repository of alternative reality from the past 4 years, where white is black.
The Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised.
Where down is up.
The year 2005 will be recorded as a turning point in the history of Iraq, the history of the Middle East, and the history of freedom.
Where the end is really the beginning.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Blame faulty intelligence, wishful thinking, or willful deception. It's the official record of how the United States has systematically sold and sustained an unwise and ultimately disastrous war.
Because of you, our nation is more secure. Because of you, the tyrant has fallen and Iraq is free.
Hello, I'm Bob McEwen. Welcome to the Fifth Estate. American presidents lie for many reasons. Richard Nixon did it during Watergate to try to save his presidency. Bill Clinton lied about Monica Lewinsky to try to salvage his reputation, maybe his marriage. But when presidents don't tell the truth about war, as has consistently been the case with George W. Bush, the public has every right to ask, are they lying to protect the country or lying to protect themselves? Since the U.S.-led invasion 4 years ago, here at the Fifth Estate, we've covered Iraq and the war on terror from virtually every angle. The military, the media, intelligence, politics, revealing aspects of the story that you didn't find anywhere else. Now, we'll put all of that together to reveal what was true, what was not, and how those false or misleading words and ideas have left Iraq, and arguably the world, far more dangerous places than they were before. And as we watch that same pattern emerge again, this time in White House statements about Iran, its support of terrorism, and its nuclear threat, it's worth considering how we got to where we are today, the lies that led to war. It all started with what seemed a simple statement.
For America, 9/11 was more than a tragedy. It changed the way we look at the world.
That soon became conventional wisdom. Of course, it's not that the terrible events of September 11th, 2001 didn't change a great deal. Obviously, they did.
I can hear you!
At least at first, they galvanized the American people in support of their president.
I can hear you! The rest of the world hears you! And the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
But 9/11 also disguised the fact that the seeds of the Iraq War were planted long before the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon.
I wish I could tell you it was about oil. I wish I could tell you it was about Israel. No, this is about an idea.
According to investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, that idea began with a small group of conservative thinkers in Washington who believed that if the U.S. deposed Saddam Hussein, a tidal wave of democracy would roll around the world.
I wish I could tell you it was as simple as they were lying, which would be that would be great if they were just lying, because that would suggest some other reality that they know about.
It was a worldview that dated back to 1991 and the first war with Iraq. In the euphoria after the liberation of Kuwait, a Pentagon official named Paul Wolfowitz began working on a plan that he eventually called the Project for a New American Century, a 21st century dominated by the United States. The U.S. would use its unprecedented economic and military power to impose democratic values and protect American interests, if necessary, by preemptive force. According to this letter to then-President Bill Clinton, the trigger would be the overthrow of Saddam Hussein.
Go in there, lay it down, it rolls over. Iraq rolls over, Saddam is ousted. You get rid of the top leadership, you get a moderate Ba'athist regime, and a democracy flows out of, like water out of a fountain.
The Project for a New American Century insisted Iraq would be like Paris after the Second World War. American troops greeted as liberators.
Just go in, it's going to roll over. They believe this. They believe this. Utopian, idealist, crazy.
That manifesto was signed by a pantheon of conservative thinkers, many now familiar names. They couldn't convince Bill Clinton.
Governor, are you ready to take the oath?
But 3 years later, that would change.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
George W. Bush appointed to his new administration at least 10 of the hawks in the Project for a New American Century. Among them, Vice President Dick Cheney, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, Rumsfeld's deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, Pentagon advisors Richard Pearl, and former CIA Director James Woolsey. Now they were locked and loaded. All they needed was a reason to pull the trigger, a crisis, as they put it in this document late in the year 2000, on the scale of Pearl Harbor.
Oh my God, there it goes!
Al-Qaeda just happened to take care of that. James Woolsey.
This country changed September 11th, just the way it changed December 7th of 1941. We are going to destroy our enemies.
Indeed, in his first State of the Union address after 9/11, George Bush endorsed that new world order.
The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
The next day, the hawks voiced their approval. This pronouncement from the Project for a New American Century, that at last the United States understands its role in the world. So 9/11 didn't really change everything at all. It simply provided what those in the Bush administration had been waiting for, an excuse to put their manifesto into action. And after the carnage at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the invasion of Afghanistan, headquarters of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, was an easy war to sell, both at home and abroad. But the White House had a much greater challenge: how to find a way to connect the September 11th attacks to Iraq, so they could take aim at the target they wanted most, Saddam Hussein.
Any nation that continues to harbor or support terrorism will be regarded by the United States as a hostile regime.
After the worst attacks ever on U.S. soil, George W. Bush set out not only to get even with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, but also to get Saddam. It would require a certain disregard for the truth.
Do you believe that Saddam Hussein had connections to Al-Qaeda?
There's no evidence that he had any connections at all.
For 21 years, Robert Baer was a top CIA agent, mostly in the Middle East. After 9/11, he watched as the U.S. began to shift blame to Iraq.
There wasn't an Iraqi involved in September 11th. There's no evidence there was any connection at all. And this is, months after the war, months after we've gone through the documentation of Iraqi intelligence. And yet we go to war with Iraq. It's just, the mind boggles. For me, it does.
According to Baer, the U.S. was more than willing to ignore the true source of the terror on September 11th, and in the previous several years. A bomb in Saudi Arabia kills 5 U.S. soldiers. 19 American soldiers die in another Saudi bombing at a U.S. military barracks. More than 200 perish when truck bombs devastate 2 U.S. embassies in Africa. A suicide explosion tears apart the USS Cole. 17 American sailors are killed. Though Osama bin Laden, from one of Saudi Arabia's most powerful families, was obviously responsible for most of those hundreds of deaths, U.S. intelligence effectively ignored the place that was his recruitment hotbed.
Even though there had been the bombings in 95, 96, 98, and 2000, all involving Saudis, no one asked for a national intelligence estimate if Saudi Arabia is the new terror state.
The Bush administration knew that 15 of the 19 September 11th hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, and that bin Laden and al-Qaeda had received Saudi money and logistical support. In other words, that a single country had supplied the manpower, the money, and the mastermind for 9/11. But the Saudis, old friends of the U.S. and the Bushes, got a free pass.
When George W. Bush says, terrorists, those who harbor them, those who give support to them, are our enemies.
That's obviously not true, because everybody that financed September 11th is currently in Saudi Arabia and free. I mean, it was sort of like if bin Laden had said, well, you know, it's just a coincidence my guys happened to run into your towers. Are we just going to leave him alone?
Last year, Robert Baer's memoirs became a major motion picture, Syriana, about U.S. intervention in Arab politics and oil. George Clooney won an Oscar for playing him. Baer says the U.S. campaign against Iraq was like a Hollywood trailer for a war.
Look, Iraq, you know, if you could just go by the weapons of mass destruction, is a nice package if you're trying to sell a war, scare people. You know, cash in on the fear of 9/11.
And as you'll see when we come back, that took a little rewriting of history.
This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens.
In the days after September 11th, 2001, the White House took dead aim at Saddam Hussein. It apparently made little difference that Iraq had no ties to Osama bin Laden or the 9/11 hijackers. What George W. Bush needed was a slogan, something to sell the idea that Saddam was a global threat. He had to go 15 years into the past to find it.
This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children.
He gassed his own people became a mantra for President Bush as he pressed the case for war against Iraq. But though that accusation was based in historical fact, as you will see, it didn't begin to tell the whole truth, ignoring two key questions about Iraq's use of chemical weapons. What did the United States know? And what did the U.S. do about it? For those answers, you've got to go back as well, to long before George Bush called Saddam Hussein another Hitler, to the 1980s, when U.S. President Ronald Reagan wanted to call Saddam his friend.
Looking back from 2003, it's really hard to understand what it was that American policymakers found attractive about Saddam Hussein.
Former U.S. Ambassador Peter Galbraith.
At that time, the Reagan administration was indifferent to human rights, particularly in the Middle East. And it saw Saddam Hussein as a strong man with whom it could work.
In the 80s, America's arch enemy in the region wasn't Iraq, but its neighbor Iran, which had held American diplomats hostage. When the Iraqis went to war with Iran, the U.S. had found an ally. The envoy sent to seal the deal was none other than Donald Rumsfeld, who years later would label Saddam the single greatest threat to the world. But at this meeting in Baghdad, there was no such animus. Rumsfeld brought a wish list. The Americans wanted oil and to help Iraq defeat Iran. Saddam wanted money and military supplies. It was a perfect match, except for one thing. As a top-secret briefing memo shows, the United States was already well aware that Iraq was using poison gas in its war against Iran. But there's no indication Donald Rumsfeld ever mentioned it to Saddam. What's more, the U.S. knew the origin of many of Iraq's chemical weapons, was the U.S. itself.
The Iraqis were looking to use the United States, as they were using Western Europe, to acquire equipment, technology for their military forces, and if we were dumb enough to sell it to them, they were happy enough to take it.
Dr. Stephen Bryan was a Pentagon official responsible for keeping American military equipment from falling into the wrong hands. He says Saddam had a booster club in the Reagan administration, pushing to sell the Iraqis dual-use technology, which could have both civilian and military purposes, like helicopters.
And again, they said these would be used for?
Civilian, agricultural use, sprayers. And we said, spray what? We don't like that.
But despite the Pentagon's objections, more than 100 American helicopters were sold to Saddam. And though the U.S. knew about his weapons of mass destruction, it was soon giving billions in aid to Iraq, more than almost any other country, leaving Saddam Hussein free to buy even more weapons. So it came as no surprise at the White House when these shocking images began to emerge in 1988 from a town called Halabja. It was proof of what American intelligence had known for years, that Saddam was not only using poison gas against Iran, but also against his own citizens, the Kurds in the north, whom he considered his enemies too. In all, it's estimated at least 30,000 Kurds lost their lives to Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons. So, did Saddam Hussein gas his own people, as George W. Bush has repeatedly claimed? He did, in defiance of every international agreement on arms and warfare. Did the United States know about it? Absolutely, for years, apparently without saying anything. The U.S. also knew that its sales to Iraq of dual-use material, like helicopters and chemicals, could well have facilitated Saddam's mass murder campaign. But apart from issuing an official statement that denounced the gassing of the Kurds when it became public knowledge, what did the U.S. do to stop its ally, Saddam? Absolutely nothing. In fact, the next year, American financial aid to Iraq went up. Then, the horror at Halabja was forgotten for a decade and a half, until George W. Bush needed that slogan to sell his invasion.
This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens.
Never any mention of the American role in it. Next, the Bush White House set out to raise the stakes in its campaign against Saddam Hussein with its next lie, the nuclear option.
We know that Saddam Hussein had the intent to arm his regime with weapons of mass destruction.
It was Vice President Dick Cheney's job to do it.
We do know with absolute certainty that he is using his procurement system to acquire the equipment he needs in order to enrich uranium to build a nuclear weapon.
Investigative reporter Seymour Hersh says casting Saddam as a nuclear threat was crucial to convince Americans to support the war.
With that case, they could not only win the public, but they could win the Senate, the Democrats in the Senate. You have to understand, without that case, I don't think they could have gotten the authority.
So when the Central Intelligence Agency couldn't confirm the existence of an Iraqi nuclear program, Cheney began to visit CIA headquarters, demanding more forward-leaning intelligence on Iraq.
Analysts get the drift. They get the drift. They write reports critical, they go nowhere. They write a report that supports the White House. All of a sudden, they're giving briefings at the White House. Come on. Everybody gets the drift.
Dick Cheney's intelligence network soon included a secretive group at the Pentagon, which worked closely with the vice president. It was known as the OSP, the Office of Special Plans.
Their starting point was not, let's try to figure out what was going on, but let's see what kind of information we can come up with to justify the policy line that we wish to pursue.
Greg Thielman was an intelligence specialist with the U.S. State Department who watched the emergence of the OSP. It soon became clear to him what its mission was and who was behind it.
Cheney was the driving force behind an orchestrated presentation to the American public of a different version of reality than at least the reality that we saw.
In the intelligence business, that's called cherry picking, selecting individual morsels of information that support a specific point of view, and stovepiping, sending them without analysis right to the White House to be inserted into the president's script.
Facing clear evidence of peril, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun.
When I heard those speeches and read the transcripts, I recognized many of the anecdotes, many of the examples from things we were being given.
Former Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski was assigned to the Pentagon, working with Cheney's OSP staff.
Having seen the intelligence, I knew that this was a manipulation of information. It was cherry-picked information, out-of-context information, in many cases information presented as confirmed when in fact it had not been ever confirmed by the intelligence community.
Much of that information came from a source named Ahmed Shalabi, perhaps the best-known Iraqi expatriate. His organization got over $300,000 a month to provide intelligence ostensibly from inside Iraq.
Within that country.
Well, come on, you're going to pay somebody $345,000 a month. You're going to get your money's worth, right? He wants to keep the checks coming. He's going to keep telling you things.
How are you, sir? Fine. Pleasure to meet you. Thank you. How are you? Nice to see you.
Chalabi, a convicted bank swindler who hadn't lived in Iraq for years, hoped to become the Iraqi president when Saddam was ousted. His reports predicted American troops would be greeted as liberators and confirmed weapons of mass destruction.
This is what allowed Iraqi National Congress, Chalabi reports that have proven to be either completely fabricated or completely wrong, to get to the President of the United States without the proper kind of labels.
And as they ordered hundreds of thousands of American forces to the Persian Gulf, the statements from White House officials were unanimous. Saddam Hussein was a nuclear threat.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Within a 2-week or 3-week period, every senior official began to talk about mushroom clouds. How many believed it? I think most of them did.
Whether George W. Bush truly believed it or not, that threat was the urgent message in his State of the Union address in January 2003. Not only had Saddam used WMD in the past, but he was actively pursuing a nuclear future.
The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed in the 1990s that Saddam Hussein had an advanced nuclear weapons development program. The State of the Union.
Watching the speech on television was a man who knew the truth about Saddam's nuclear program. Ahmad Kaddouri now lives north of Toronto, but for years he was one of Iraq's top nuclear scientists.
I would estimate we were about 15 to 20% in 1991 of where we should have been to declare that we have a nuclear bomb.
But that never happened, according to Kaddouri, because of this.
The nuclear weapon program in Iraq stopped on the first night of the bombing of the Gulf War in 1991.
That first night, coalition aircraft launched 1,000 bombing runs in Iraq. When they were finished, Saddam's dream of an atomic bomb was too.
That's because they actually bombed the nuclear research center at the site where we did our research. Control, the manufacturing, the processing, that was bombed. Therefore, the whole program stopped.
The State of the
Ahmad Kaddouri insists none of it was ever rebuilt. But 12 years later, he heard George W. Bush use the long-defunct nuclear program as an excuse to attack Iraq again.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
And watching that State of the Union address in 2003 was someone else with a personal stake in George Bush's speech. Joe Wilson is a former U.S. ambassador in Africa, the last American diplomat to officially meet with Saddam Hussein. When the administration got a tip that Saddam had been trying to buy uranium from the African nation of Niger, the CIA dispatched Wilson to check it out.
And in essence, your conclusion was what?
Well, my conclusion was it could not have taken place. Could not have taken place, did not take place.
Joe Wilson told the Central Intelligence Agency that the rumor linking African uranium and Saddam Hussein was false. Then he heard George W. Bush say this.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
It was a message calculated to sell a war. Saddam had to be stopped before he got a nuclear bomb.
When you hear the president in that State of the Union address, what possible explanation?
Well, then it became clear to me that there had been a deliberate attempt on the part of some members of the government to deceive the U.S. Congress and deceive the American people, and indeed, given the fact that the State of the Union address is broadcast around the world, deceive the world as to the nature of the threat posed by Saddam's nuclear programs.
Wilson says he tried to convince the administration to retract the statement. Then he went public himself with this op-ed article in the New York Times. He says it was no coincidence that the next week, columnist Robert Novak reported what senior administration officials had told him, that Joe Wilson's wife was an agent for the CIA.
How beyond the pale is it for someone in the administration to reveal to a journalist like Bob Novak the identity of an undercover CIA?
It's a betrayal of national security. It is essentially the betrayal of our country. It is a treasonous act. It may never be prosecuted as such, but it is an act of betrayal of the country.
Wilson believes that leak originated at a meeting in the White House, at the office of the vice president. He says it was revenge against him by an administration interested not in the truth, but in sending a signal to others who might disagree about the war.
The idea was to tell other analysts that if you do to us what Wilson has done to us, we'll do to you what we've just done to Wilson's wife.
You're taking cheap little pathetic shots. Just giving his trying record. To tell you what the truth is.
After the break, how the Bush administration altered the way the media presented the war, dividing America and the world.
You know what I was doing?
Shut up.
Please don't tell me to shut up.
In the days, weeks, and months following 9/11, most of George W. Bush's own country and much of the Western world was united behind him.
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
But since this moment, Bush has accomplished what was then almost unthinkable. He's turned the fight against terror into a partisan issue, and he started with what may have been the most misleading statement of all.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
Call you're either with us or with the terrorists rhetoric, hyperbole, or an outright lie. It fundamentally misrepresented the reality of confronting a crucially complex situation. Now, there could be no dissent. To question the president during this war would be tantamount to treason.
I happen to believe in free speech. I mean, I made my living on it. And now I find myself with a government that, seems to feel that free speech is kind of a quaint idea. But not when we're at war.
Now, Donnie.
American television icon Phil Donahue soon found himself a lonely anti-war voice in the pro-administration world of cable TV.
American cable television became the circus where people screamed at each other. And Fox television then really popularized the notion that the world is going to hell and liberals are leading us there.
You're watching the #1 program on cable news. Enter the No Spin
As war loomed in Iraq, dissent disappeared from the U.S. agenda. No small thanks to one of the biggest names on cable television, Bill O'Reilly of Fox News.
What Jimmy Carter should do is privately give Mr. Bush's opinion and shut up publicly. That would be best for the country.
And it is our duty as loyal Americans to shut up once the fighting begins.
Once the war against Saddam begins, we expect every American to support our military, and if they can't do that, to shut up.
If the Republican Party had a TV show once a week, it would be Fox News. They would like you to believe otherwise, but the fact is they are what they are.
Charles Lewis is the founder of the Center for Public Integrity, which monitors American news coverage.
The question we got the first year after 9/11 consistently by every group, no matter what part of the world, is what's happened to the American media? What happened to Woodward and Bernstein? When did American reporters get laryngitis? When did they stop asking questions? What's wrong with the media?
You want to know what I was doing?
Shut up.
Please don't tell me to shut up.
Jeremy Glick had the compound misfortune of losing his father at the World Trade Center, then accepting Bill O'Reilly's invitation to talk about it.
Because you have a warped view of this world and a warped view of this country.
Well, explain that. Let me give you an example.
I'm not going to debate this with you.
Well, let me give you an example.
He aggressively pursued me when he found out that I was a 9/11 family member who was against the war and signed and registered my dissent publicly.
I'm not going to dress
the ruling class, the small minority.
Cut his mic. I'm not going to dress you down anymore, out of respect for your father. We'll be back in a moment with more of the factor.
We're done?
We're done.
I told O'Reilly that it was cowardly for him to cut off my mic. I thought he wanted to debate me. He said, "Get out of my studio before I tear you to fucking pieces."
Point to his name, you liar!
But it wasn't just O'Reilly and Fox.
He didn't send enough soldiers to Iraq.
In the era of with us or with the terrorists, it seemed everything on the American airwaves was right versus left.
You're taking cheap little pathetic shots.
Just giving his
trying
record.
to tell you what the truth is.
And the right was winning.
They are lucky we allow them to exist on the same continent.
And if they can't do that, to shut up.
But according to media watchdog Charles Lewis, love it or hate it, the central issue ceased to be Fox and became pro-administration bias in the so-called mainstream media.
Most of the major American media have apologized for their coverage as being too deferential and not sufficiently critical leading up to the war. And in fact, it was just that. It encouraged the war drums. They banged the war drums as loudly as anyone.
What followed was the rush to war in Iraq. With U.S. troops on the Iraqi border, NBC News commissioned a consultant's report on its 24-hour cable channel, MSNBC.
America's news channel.
The report's prime target, MSNBC host and anti-war voice, Phil Donahue.
There's a fear, there's really a palpable fear among the executive decision-making levels of American broadcasting, especially when we were rolling into Iraq, of the anti-war voice. Fear.
And that consultant's report gave NBC executives reason to fear. It slammed Donahue as a left-wing liberal out of touch with the current marketplace and a difficult public face for NBC at a time of war. And it raised the possibility the Donahue show would become a home for the liberal anti-war agenda at the same time as its competitors were waving the flag. With the U.S. poised to invade, MSNBC canceled Donahue, blaming the ratings.
I truly do believe that if I had been as passionately for the war as I was against the war, I would still have a program on MSNBC.
And so it's gone for the past 4 years, the growing gap between what was said and done about Iraq and what was true.
The year 2005 will be recorded as a turning point in the history of Iraq, the history of the Middle East, and a history of freedom.
Journalist Seymour Hersh.
Do they get it now?
No.
That it wasn't the way they've been saying it was?
You mean we're going to learn from past mistakes? We're going to learn? America's going to learn from what happened, what went wrong before? What? Huh? Where? How? Show me evidence.
Evidence or no evidence, true believers like conservative pundit Ann Coulter still claim what the White House always has, that the war is being won.
Do you truly believe that Iraq is a better place today than it was?
No, I'm
2 years
constantly
ago?
saying things I don't believe. Yes, of course it is.
When we spoke with her 2 years ago, Coulter saw even the carnage on the streets of Baghdad as a sign of democratic progress.
Would not the argument be that there were other means to move that cause along without destroying half the country?
No.
So,
no, as we know.
So to free
now,
the Iraqis, destroying a good portion of their country and killing tens of thousands of them was just part of the deal. We were ultimately doing
No,
them a
you're
favor.
right. Sanctions were going gangbusters. They were working just fine.
Apparently, they got rid of those weapons of mass destruction, didn't they?
Do you get newspapers in Canada? Yes, there were weapons of mass destruction. There were not stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. We found them. He's used weapons of mass destruction. He used them against his own people. He used them against his neighbors.
To this day, Coulter still insists, as she did to us, that the outcome in Iraq will be worth it.
The Middle East is going to be a completely different place in 5 years, 6 years. Well, soon it already is. And then we're not going to have to worry about Arabs flying planes into our skyscrapers any more than we worry about kamikaze pilots now. And Canada can stick its head in the sand, but it doesn't matter. We're making the world a better place.
But some of the neoconservatives who lobbied so hard to attack Iraq have changed their tune, criticizing the incompetence with which the war was planned and carried out, though almost all still stand by their cause, spreading American values throughout the world, as former CIA Director James Woolsey did when we spoke after the invasion.
Can you understand how people in the rest of the world, or some of the rest of the world, listen now to the rationalizations of the war in Iraq, and given what was said before and what's happened there since, look on it as justification of what is still a bad idea?
Sure, a lot of people are predisposed to think bringing democracy and the rule of law to the Middle East is a bad idea because they don't want to have to make a contribution to it, and because I think they want to put their head in the sand and believe that everything will work out fine.
Or might think that preemptive war without consensus internationally is a bad thing?
It's a traditional view. I think the president's made a good case that in a world of people like Saddam, Khamenei in Iran, Kim Jong-il in North Korea, that waiting for the associations with terrorists and the chemical, bacteriological, nuclear weapons programs to mature is an unsound view.
Since our conversation, James Woolsey has conceded that defeat in Iraq is now a real possibility, that the consequences could be awful, and that if there's any hope left, as he told us, it may only be after a very long haul.
I think we will be engaged in the war in Iraq for years and engaged in trying to bring changes to the Middle East for decades. As I said, this will be like the Cold War. It'll last for decades.
Indeed, after just 4 years, with more than 3,000 Americans killed and unimaginable civilian death and destruction, the war in Iraq has now lasted longer than the U.S. involvement in World War II, with no end in sight, and little, if any, admission the White House ever got any of it wrong.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended.
But remember this? Just 6 weeks after the invasion in 2003, George W. Bush gave a victory speech on an aircraft carrier in front of a banner that said, "Mission accomplished."
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. The United States and our allies have prevailed.
Well, you can still find that speech on the presidential website. But a black band across the bottom of the frame has conveniently pushed the "Mission Accomplished" banner out of sight at the top, a rare hint of any misstep in the White House version of the war.
The real question I always ask is, how did 8 or 9 neoconservatives who are basically utopians get control of the American government? How did they overwhelm the Congress, the press, the bureaucracy, all of us? How did they simply run us into the ground? Is our democracy that fragile?
According to Seymour Hersh, the lingering question is this. Was George W. Bush lying to us about the war in Iraq, or was he lying to himself?
I'm telling you, we would be better off if the president and the vice president and Rumsfeld really all got together and said, "Wow, we put one over on everybody. We got rid of Saddam and this is great." No, they believed it. And that's what's really frightening.
If you want to know more about this or any of our stories, you can go to our website. It's easy to find at cbc.ca/fifth. And we appreciate hearing from you. Let us know your thoughts about this program or ideas you might have for stories. Just go to the website and click on the link that says Contact Us. It's over on the right margin. Or you can mail us at the Fifth Estate, Box 500, Station A, Toronto, M5W 1E6. And we do read everything that you send. Now stay with us, because when we come back, we'll have a look at next week's show. It's one you won't want to miss. Welcome back. Next week on the Fifth Estate, we'll have the next installment in our story about lotteries, a story that had the whole country talking. Here's Gillian Findlay with a preview.
It started with our story about a lottery winner, cheated of his prize and ignored by the powers that be. The story of a little guy who just wouldn't give up.
What did you think they were doing?
Trying to make them look like they were telling the truth, and I wasn't telling the truth.
Then, when the lottery operators wanted to write that case off as one of a kind, we told you why that just wasn't true. Those powers that be weren't very happy.
Does the public not have a right to get some answers about serious questions that we raise?
I'm going to ask you to turn them off. I'm going to ask you to turn that off.
It is entirely possible that this organization paid out millions of dollars in fraudulent claims. Do you accept that?
Actually, I don't believe that to be the case.
You don't?
Coming soon, another exclusive report, another chapter in our ongoing unraveling story of luck, big bucks, and spin control.
The system isn't working very well in terms of ferreting out what's really going on.
We showed you these new documents that were leaked to us. When you saw that document with the new cases in 2003 that were investigated, what did you think?
First of all, it made me think that Mr. Edmonds' case wasn't an isolated incident, as the lottery corporation said it was. The amount of money involved was surprising.
And that's our program for this week. For everyone here at the Fifth Estate, I'm Bob McEwen. Thank you for watching. We'll see you soon.
Are men really smarter than women? Think you're brighter than your parents? Find out with Testination IQ, Canada's biggest ever interactive IQ quiz. The whole country can play by logging on to cbc.ca/Testination or with your official scorecard found in March 17th's National Post. Or sit back and enjoy as 6 teams and a panel of celebrities battle it out in front of a live studio audience. Canada, start your pencils. Testination IQ, coming March 18th to CBC Television. Brought to you in part by Quaker. Eat hearty. Championship Curling on CBC. Canada's best go head-to-head. Down to the last shot. Who will triumph? The 2007 Tim Hortons Brier, March 10th and 11th. A championship weekend only on CBC.
You're watching CBC.